September 1943, Western Desert, Egypt. The sun beats down relentlessly on the dry earth, casting long, jagged shadows across the barren landscape. The heat is suffocating, the air thick with the stench of dust and gunpowder, as British forces prepare for a mission that could change the course of the war, or seal their fate. It's the kind of place where the line between life and death is thin, and where every tactical decision feels like it could tip the scale. Somewhere amidst the sweltering chaos, Major John W. Smith sits alone in his modest tent, poring over maps, charts, and schematics that no one else seems to care about. To others, it's just another assignment, another battlefield. But for Smith, there's something far more critical at play. Something that, if missed, would cost them all dearly. The war, despite its sprawling scale and brutal violence, has a way of narrowing a soldier's focus. And Major Smith, a quiet, reserved figure in the field, had always been attuned to the details that others overlooked. His concern isn't about the daily mechanics of survival in this desert hellscape, or even the enemy's movements. No, his concern runs deeper, and it's hidden beneath the surface of the desert, a problem that hasn't yet fully surfaced but has already started claiming lives. The British Army is in trouble, not because of the strength of the enemy or lack of resources, but because of a fundamental flaw in their approach. Smith has been running simulations for months, tracing the trajectories of bombs, observing the movement of troops, and studying the patterns of supply lines. It's not the big mistakes that bother him, the ones that can be seen coming, like miscalculations in air support or logistical snafus, but the small ones. The unnoticed details that slip through the cracks of military strategy, the ones that could mean life or death. A report had recently come across his desk that confirmed his suspicions. Units were being decimated, not because they were poorly equipped or outgunned, but because of a single, glaring oversight. The problem lay not in what the soldiers were doing, but in the way they were being targeted. In his quiet moments, Smith had realized what others had missed. There was a pattern to the bombings, an almost ritualistic precision. The enemy wasn't bombing random locations. They were hitting something specific. The more Smith dug, the clearer it became. The Axis forces weren't just striking at the obvious military targets. They were also targeting the transport routes and supply lines that the British had set up to keep their troops alive. Roads, supply depots, and staging areas. These were just as vulnerable as any fortress. And the worst part? These strikes were being planned with meticulous detail, often hitting when the forces were most vulnerable or in the middle of critical redeployments. As Smith sat alone in his tent, the hum of distant artillery fire in the background, a thought began to form, one that would seem absurd to anyone else in the room. What if the problem wasn't the vulnerability of the troops, but the way they were being tracked? What if the solution was simpler than anyone dared to imagine? What if the British Army could deceive the enemy? He thought about deception not in terms of the usual camouflage or misleading tactics, but something far more daring, a perfect illusion that could save hundreds, even thousands of lives. His mind raced through the possibilities, each more audacious than the last. What if the army could create something that wasn't just a decoy, but a complete ruse? What if they could construct entire bridges that didn't exist at all, designed specifically to mislead the enemy into thinking vital infrastructure was still intact, when in reality, it was a carefully constructed trap? The very thought of it made him uneasy. The scale of the deception was immense, and the risk was even greater. If the deception failed, it could lead to an even more disastrous outcome. And yet, Smith could not shake the feeling that this might be the only way to tilt the war in their favor. The traditional methods of defense had proven ineffective, and time was running out. Smith knew he had to act quickly, but his proposal would likely be seen as insanity by his superiors. The British High Command had little tolerance for untested, unconventional ideas. Yet, despite the pressure, he felt a quiet resolve settle within him. His intuition told him that the key to winning this battle wasn't in fighting the enemy with brute force, but in using their own assumptions against them. He needed to create an illusion, a mirage, that would confuse and ultimately save lives. That evening, as the desert night began to fall, Smith drafted a report outlining his theory and what he needed to make it work. He knew it would be a tough sell. There were no precedents for something like this, no historical examples, no military doctrines to support his idea. He was on his own, but he believed in the power of deception, in the ancient art of misdirection that had, throughout history, turned the tide of battles in unexpected ways. The following day, Smith walked to the command tent with the report in hand. The generals were gathered around a map, discussing the next move in the campaign. The noise of the base was a constant hum in the background, punctuated by the occasional roar of aircraft overhead. Smith waited for an opportune moment, then cleared his throat and placed his report on the table. "Major Smith, what's this?" General Marcus Colton, a grizzled veteran of the war, glanced at the document but didn't immediately pick it up. "It's a proposal, sir," Smith said, trying to keep his voice steady. "A solution to the problem we're facing with the bombings." Colton raised an eyebrow. "And what problem would that be?" "We're being bombed, Major. Every army in history has had to deal with that. Nothing new." Smith swallowed. "The problem, sir, is that our supply lines and staging areas are being targeted with precision. If we continue on the current path, we'll lose the war, not to the enemy's firepower, but to their knowledge of our weaknesses." Colton shook his head. "This sounds like paranoia. What do you suggest, then?" Smith took a deep breath. "What if we could create an illusion, something that looks exactly like a supply route, a bridge, or a staging area, but isn't real? A perfect decoy." There was a long silence in the tent. Smith could feel the weight of the room, the disbelief hanging in the air. Colton leaned back in his chair, staring at him. "You want to fool the enemy into thinking we have infrastructure we don't?" "Yes, sir. A false bridge, one made from scrap materials, but designed to look as authentic as possible. It could divert their bombers, save our real supply lines, and buy us crucial time." The room fell silent again. Smith could feel the skepticism radiating from the officers. There was no precedent for something like this. In the rigid world of military strategy, deception was a tool used in small doses, not as the cornerstone of an entire campaign. But despite the resistance, Smith stood his ground. "This could be the difference between victory and defeat," he said quietly. "If we don't try it, we might as well hand them the victory ourselves." General Colton finally spoke, his voice heavy with doubt. "You're asking us to gamble with everything we have left. And if it fails?" Smith's gaze hardened. "If it fails, we'll be no worse off than we are now." And so, against the prevailing wisdom, Major Smith's audacious plan began to take shape. It was a gamble, one that could either save thousands of lives or lead to utter disaster. But the clock was ticking, and with every passing hour, more soldiers were dying. Smith knew that sometimes, in war, the only path forward was the one least traveled. The first steps toward deception had begun. As the day wore on and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the desert, Smith stood alone by the edge of a bluff, staring out at the vast emptiness. The first of many fakes would soon be constructed, he thought. They were only shadows now, mirages on a battlefield of forgotten dreams. And yet, somehow, they felt more real than the war itself. October 1943, Cairo, Egypt. The air had begun to cool. The once oppressive heat of the desert softened under the thickening evening sky. Yet even with the stars emerging in the darkened expanse above, the war never truly ceased. The distant rumblings of artillery and the low hum of engines filled the air with a constant reminder of the chaos that was unfolding just miles away. In the heart of the city, Major John W. Smith's bold idea was no longer confined to the dusty maps and theoretical discussions that had filled his solitary moments in the desert. It had taken shape in a way that could no longer be undone. Now, there was only the task of making a reality. Smith sat in a small, dimly lit office tucked away in a corner of a nondescript building that served as one of many military operations centers. He stared at the sketches of the bridge, the plan he had proposed, and the engineers who would bring it to life. They were not the high-ranking officers that filled the meeting halls or the decorated generals whose names echoed through the corridors of power. No, these men were outsiders in their own right, often overlooked, rarely given credit for their work. They were the engineers, the laborers, the hands that built rather than commanded. And yet, it was they who had turned Smith's vision into something tangible. At the head of the table sat Sergeant Thomas, a wiry man with a sharp eye for detail. He was a man of few words but infinite precision. His hands, callous from years of field work, seemed to move almost instinctively over the plans laid before him. Beside him, Corporal Hughes, a young and enthusiastic member of the team, fidgeted nervously. He was eager to prove himself, but the task ahead of them was monumental. Building a bridge, even a fake one, in the middle of a desert where resources were limited, was no simple feat yet. It was not the construction itself that weighed heavily on their minds. It was the sheer audacity of the plan, creating something that could deceive an entire enemy force into thinking it was real. It wasn't just a matter of engineering. It was a matter of perfect execution, of getting everything exactly right. Smith looked around the room at the faces of the men who would take part in this operation. Their expressions ranged from cautious curiosity to outright disbelief, but there was no time for hesitation now. They had all heard the doubts expressed in the higher echelons of command, the skepticism that had been planted in the minds of those who held the power. Most generals had dismissed the idea out of hand, too bound by traditional tactics to imagine something as unorthodox as this could work. But there were others, quieter figures in the shadows of the military machine, who saw the glimmer of possibility in Smith's vision. And it was they who had given the green light to proceed. It wasn't a ringing endorsement. It was more like a reluctant nod, a gamble they were willing to take because they had nothing else left to lose. The team of engineers was small but determined, and together, they began to gather the materials needed for the task ahead. They scoured the surrounding areas for anything that could serve as the foundation of the fake bridge: scrap metal, broken pieces of wood, even discarded military equipment that had been abandoned during previous campaigns. The desert offered little, but the men knew how to make do with what they had. Each piece they collected was carefully examined, each decision scrutinized with the kind of meticulousness that could make or break the entire operation. The real trick would be in the details. It wasn't enough to simply build a structure that looked vaguely like a bridge. It had to be convincing down to the smallest element: the rust on the metal, the way the light hit the surface, the way shadows fell across it at different times of the day. For days, they worked without rest, constructing the bridge in sections under the cover of darkness. There was no room for error, no margin for miscalculation. The desert wind howled around them, a constant companion to their labor, but their focus never wavered. They worked in the dead of night, the only light coming from the flickering glow of lanterns, casting eerie shadows on the sand. The silence of the desert amplified the weight of their task, and the quiet desperation of the situation only pushed them to work harder, faster, with greater intensity. Each man knew what was at stake. Failure meant not just a lost mission, but the loss of lives, maybe even the failure of the entire campaign. As the days passed and the fake bridge began to take shape, there was a palpable sense of tension hanging in the air. Major Smith would often visit the construction site, standing on the periphery, his eyes scanning the work with a mixture of pride and anxiety. There was no blueprint for what they were attempting. The world had never seen a deception like this on such a scale before. But Smith had a quiet confidence in the project, a belief that this, however improbable, was the only path forward. He had been right about the enemy's precision targeting, and he had no reason to believe they wouldn't be just as accurate when it came to bombarding these false structures. It was the smallest details that would ultimately determine whether or not the deception would succeed. The engineers knew this. They had studied everything from the specific materials that would best replicate the look of a bridge to the way the bridge would reflect light during the day. They also had to factor in the angle from which the enemy bombers would approach and how to make the illusion visible from the sky. The real challenge, however, was not just about creating the right visual effect. It was about creating the right sound. Bridges, real or fake, weren't silent objects. They creaked, they groaned under the weight of vehicles, and they reverberated with the vibrations of heavy machinery. The engineers had to replicate this too. There were no shortcuts in this kind of work. They were creating something that had to be perfect. Smith found himself becoming increasingly consumed by the project. As the days blurred together, his mind raced through all the potential pitfalls. What if the enemy saw through the deception? What if a bomber pilot, trained to look for subtle clues, noticed the unnatural way the shadows fell on the bridge at certain times of day? What if the sound of the wind in the desert was too loud, drowning out the faint creaks and groans they had worked so hard to mimic? These questions nagged at him, but he pushed them aside. There was no time for second-guessing now. The plan had been set in motion, and they had no choice but to see it through. And then, on the third night of construction, it happened. The first test. A lone aircraft appeared on the horizon. Its silhouette was sharp against the darkening sky, the unmistakable hum of its engines cutting through the stillness of the desert night. For a moment, the engineers froze, their breath held in the collective tension of the moment. Was it a bomber, or just another reconnaissance plane? They had no way of knowing, but all they could do was wait. The plane passed overhead, high above the fake bridge, but its path didn't shift. The engine noise gradually faded as it flew further into the night, and the men exhaled a collective breath they hadn't realized they had been holding. Smith, standing off to the side, finally spoke, his voice low but filled with quiet urgency. "That was a close one," he murmured. But they didn't see it. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The bridge was still standing, and for now, the ruse had worked. But Smith knew the real test was yet to come. The deception had to be perfect. One flaw, one unnoticed mistake, and the entire plan could fall apart. They had no choice but to keep building, to keep perfecting their creation, and to pray that when the time came, the enemy would see only what they wanted them to see. Each day that passed saw the bridge grow closer to completion. The men worked tirelessly, pushing themselves to the edge of exhaustion. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, there was something else that began to surface, an unspoken bond between them all. They were no longer just a group of engineers and soldiers following orders. They had become something more, a team united by a single, improbable mission. A mission that, if successful, could save countless lives and shift the balance of the war. But if they failed, it wouldn't just be their lives at risk. It would be the lives of every soldier in the British forces. January 1944, the Mediterranean coast. The war, in all its chaos and brutality, had a strange way of leaving certain truths buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and the fog of conflict. It wasn't just the soldiers on the front lines who bore the brunt of the violence, but the quiet engineers and tacticians whose work, invisible to most, often made the difference between life and death. Major John W. Smith had known that from the beginning. But as the months passed, as the illusion of the fake bridge he had orchestrated became reality, Smith's growing fear wasn't just about whether the deception would succeed. It was about the aftermath, the reckoning that would inevitably follow.